Hello everyone. We're back on hackerrank.com today because today we're going to be solving a programming problem. Now, the problem is this, that given an integer n, perform the following conditional actions. If n is odd, print weird. If n is even and in the inclusive range of 2 to 5, print not weird. If n is even and in the inclusive range of 6 to 20, print weird. But if n is even and greater than 20, print not weird. Okay, so that's what the problem is. Now, a crucial thing to observe in this problem is that this problem requires any program that will solve it to perform certain actions based on certain conditions. Okay, so only if some condition is satisfied, then we should perform this action or this instruction, and if it's not satisfied, then we should kind of skip that instruction or perform some other instruction, right? And this is basically what we learned in the previous video about conditional statements or if-else statements, right? So this is a clear indication that we need to use if-else in this program, which is where the title of the program also comes from. It's literally called Python if-else. Okay, so let's now try to discuss the algorithm for this problem. Okay, so we discussed what the problem is. Let's now try to develop an algorithm for this. Now, a helpful idea that you can use while developing algorithms is really simple. It's a flowchart. Okay, so if you try to write the algorithm that you're developing as a flowchart, it can really help you get a clearer picture of what you actually want to implement in your code. Okay, this is especially helpful if you're just beginning out, and especially in topics like conditional statements or questions that only require something to do with if else or loops. You should definitely try to go down this flowchart strategy, especially in the beginning stages of your journey. So let's try to build a flowchart algorithm for the problem given to us. Okay, so how do we start? The flowchart just starts with the input given to us, right? N, an integer. Now we first check if n is odd. Okay, so we can try to make a flowchart here somewhat like this. Here this branch is for if n is odd, right? If n is odd, then we just print weird, right? Now the other branch would obviously be if n is even, right? So if n is even, then we need to check some more conditions, right, before we can reach to a final answer. So the first condition would be that if n is even and it is in the inclusive range of 2 to 5. So in this if n is even branch, we'll have another branch coming out that checks if n is greater than equal to 2 and less than equal to 5. Okay, then we need to print not weird, right? Now another condition that we have to check if n is even is the third point given in the problem. If n is even and in the inclusive range of 6 to 20, print weird. So in this branch we can check if n is greater than equal to 6 or less than equal to 20, then print weird, right? And finally, the last branch that we have to check when n is even is that if it's greater than 20, then print not weird, right? So if n is greater than 20, then print not weird. So that's it. we've come up with an algorithm that can help us solve this problem, right? We basically take our input integer n. We first use conditional statements to check if it is odd. If it is odd, we just print weird, right? But if it isn't odd, that means it's even, right? So if we get into that situation, then we use another set of conditional statements. So first we can check if n is between 2 and 5, then print not weird, right? Then we can check if this first condition fails. So else if n is between 6 and 20, then print weird, right? And even if this condition fails, then we can check else if n is greater than 20, or simply we could write else also in our code, print not weird, right? So that's our algorithm. Now let's try to code this up on HackerRank. So now let's try to implement the algorithm that we designed. So the first thing we need to do is accept input, right? Now the input format given here is that it's just a single line containing a positive integer n. So we know how to accept input like this. All we have to do is n is equal to int input, right? And that's it. Now, the first thing according to our algorithm, we need to check if n is odd. So when is a number odd? A number n is odd if the remainder of n with 2 is equal to 1, right? So let's write that in code. If n mod 2, n mod 2 returns the remainder of n when it's divided by 2, right? So if this remainder is equal to 1, then we know that n is odd. And when n is odd, we need to print weird, right? Now let's write else here, okay? Because if n isn't odd, then that means that n is even. So if n isn't odd, then we'll directly go into this else block of code that we're going to write right now, okay? At this point, let's go back and see what our algorithm was once, okay? So our algorithm says that if n is even, then we need to check a few conditions again, right? Which means what we're actually going to do in our code is use that variation that we discussed in the previous video called nested ifs. Okay, so let's go back to the code once. One second. Yeah. So in the code, what we'll do is we'll check another condition here again. So if n is greater than equal to 2 and n is less than equal to 5, right? We had to check if n lies between 2 and 5, both inclusive, right? So that will happen if n is greater than equal to 2 and at the same time n is also less than equal to 5, right? This and is one of the Boolean operators that we are using here, okay? So if these two conditions are both satisfied simultaneously, then we had to print not weird, okay? So print not weird, all right? But if this condition isn't satisfied, then what should we do? Then according to our algorithm, which is here, we need to check another condition, right? Which is if n lies between 6 and 20, okay? So we can't directly write else here, right? So what should we write? We should write elif, because we have to check another condition, not by default execute another block of code. Okay, so elif n lies between 6 and 20. So n is greater than equal to 6 but less than equal to 20. Then print weird, right? And finally, if n is not between 2 and 5 and it's not between 6 and 20, that means n is greater than 20, right? So we can directly write an else here as the default thing that should happen if the first condition and second condition both fail. So the first condition and second condition both fail means that n is greater than 20. In that case, the block of code that we're going to write now beneath else is going to be executed. So that should just be print not weird, right? And that's it. That's all that our code is. So we've used if else as well as we've used nested if statements, right? So now let's try and run this code so that we see if it's correct or not. So it passes the sample cases. Now to check if it actually works for all cases perfectly, let's try to submit it. So it does, right? It works for all the cases perfectly. That means our code is correct. Okay, so that was today's video. Thank you all for watching, and I hope that this problem was clear. Our algorithm and solution and code solution was clear. If you have any doubts, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you.